Hey guys, would it be possible if we did a colorless goblin noise?
Shut up, Jerry.
Hey gang, just to let you know, you can now use the promo code MTGMudsta, all caps, at flipsidegaming.com and originalmagicart.store. Using the code gets you 10% off orders $10 or more, and you get to help out the channel at the same time. Hey gang, and welcome to another MagicFest New Jersey game. Today's game has me playing the master of many, Mistform Ultimus, keeping Nykthos, Island, Unesh, Hedron Archive, Soul Ring, Rewind, and Cryptic Command. New to the channel, Steve is playing the always attacking Aurelia, keeping Boros Signet, Bruce Taro, Linvala Keeper of Silence, Launch the Fleet, A Plains, and Tithe. We've also got Danny, who if you're at MagicFest New Jersey, you might remember the cosplayer in the Sharktocrab costume. That's him. He's been newly indicted into the Xenagos code, and he keeps Ravager Worm, Life's Legacy, Scalding Tarn, Green Sun Zenith, and a Forest. And last but not least, we have Brion bringing his Yidris deck, and he keeps a Gate to Aether, Mountain, Forest, Zur's Weirding, Howling Mind, Exploration, and Cinder Glade. I win the die roll and start us off. I play Nykthos, and I pass to Steve. Steve plays a Plains, passing. Danny plays a Forest and casts Soul Ring, which he'd just drawn. Brion plays a Forest and he casts Exploration. He then drops a tapped Cinder Glade, passing. At the end of turn, Steve casts Tithe, getting to go and find 2 Plains cards because Brion has more lands than he does. I play an Island and I cast Soul Ring. Steve reveals that he found a Plains and a Sacred Foundry, and we move to his turn. Steve plays a Sacred Foundry untapped, taking 2. Danny plays a Scalding Tarn, and he casts Green Sun Zenith where X is 0. He cracks his fetch at the same time to find both a land and Dryad Arbor. Brion plays a Mountain and an Exotic Orchard for his lands for turn. He puts Zur's Weirding onto the stack, which gets a quick counter from me with Swan Song. Danny is a fan of this card, and congratulates Brion on what Danny calls a fun deck. I, on the other hand, give Brion his Swan token with disdain. I play an Island for turn, and I cast Thought Vessel in my main phase. I'm not done ramping as I drop a Hedron Archive with the rest of my mana, and I pass to Steve. Steve drops a Plains and casts Boros Signet. He then passes to Danny. Danny plays a Mountain and brings out Xenagos. He puts the Xenagos combat trigger on his scrawny Dryad Arbor, and he hits me for 2 before passing. Brion plays a Howling Mind and swings the Song at Danny for 2. I draw 2 for turn, and I pay 6 to cast Unesh. I give the trigger to Brion to make the piles, and looking to curry some favor, he gives me all 4 cards like a gentleman. I then play an Island and pass to Steve, who isn't done with my turn. He casts Reprisal and targets Unesh, destroying my Sphinx. Steve draws 2, and he casts Kytheon's Irregulars in his main phase, needing all of his mana. Danny draws 2 and plays a Windswept Heath. He casts Nylea in his main phase, and he moves to combat. The Dryad Arbor gets pumped up once more, and goes at Brion this time for 2 damage. Brion plays a tapped Drowned Catacomb, missing an island or a swamp to have it come in untapped. He plays a Simic Growth Chamber, bouncing the Exotic Orchard back to his hand, and passes. I play a Sliverhive as my land for turn, and I cast Fabricate. I go and grab Obsidian Battle Axe, which I have sadly since cut from my deck. I then cast the Axe, and follow up with Mistform. The Axe gets to attach to Mistform for free, and I move to combat, getting some sweet revenge on Danny, with Mistform dealing 5 commander damage. I then pass to Steve. Steve asks if I'm tapped out, which I am, and he then taps out to cast Bruce Taro, giving the Irregulars Double Strike and Lifelink. Steve then swings them at me for 8 damage, and gains 8 life. The Irregulars then get their Renown trigger, getting a +1/+1 counter on them, and he passes to Danny. Danny plays a Misty Rainforest and cracks it, but shortcuts first by casting a Ravager Worm. He has it gain a +1/+1 counter for the Riot trigger, and then has it fight Bruce Taro as it comes in. Moving to combat, the Xenagos trigger goes on the Worm, and Danny swings 10 damage towards Steve. Danny then grabs the Force he was meant to get with the Misty Rainforest, and in his second main phase, casts Life's Legacy targeting the Ravager Worm. He sacrifices the Worm and draws 10 cards. Danny then moves to discard down to 7, and he passes to Brion. Brion draws his 2 cards and casts Leyline of Anticipation in his main phase. He then drops a Canyon Slough and replays the Exotic Orchard as his land for turn, before passing. I play an Island and cast Lord of the Unreal in my first main phase. I swing Mistform once more at Danny, dealing 6 commander damage this time. I then pass to Steve. Steve draws his 2 and casts his own Soul Ring for the game. Moving to combat, Steve likes how clear the path is to Danny, and he swings the irregulars at him for 5. In his second main phase, Steve then casts Audric and passes. Danny plays a Forest for his turn, and he casts a Hellkite Tyrant. He puts the Xenagos trigger on the dragon, and swings it at me. Before damage is done, I activate Nykthos to make 3 blue, and tap a land to cast Cryptic Command. I bounce the dragon, and draw a card. In his post-combat main phase, Danny casts Birds of Paradise, and passes. Brion plays a Blighted Woodland and a Sunken Hollow as his lands for turn, before dropping a Font of Mythos. He then passes to me. I draw a bunch of cards for turn and play an island. I then swing Mistform at Brion because he's up to something, and he takes the hit for 6. In my second main phase, I cast Mirage Mirror and pass to Steve. Steve plays a command tower for turn and brings out Nahiri the Harbinger. He downticks her to exile Xenagos and goes at Danny once more. Danny blocks the irregulars with his birds, and he takes 3 from Audric. Steve then has to discard down to 7, and he passes turn. At the end of turn, Brion cracks his Blighted Woodland for 2 basics, while I crack my Hedron Archive for 2 cards. Danny draws 4 for his turn, which is just fantastic, and he plays a Firelit Thicket. He then casts a Carnage Tyrant in his main phase, and gives Nylea her weapon back as he casts Bow of Nylea. Steve gets aggressive on Brion's turn, casting a Moonhold and paying a red and white into the 3-costing spell. This means Brion can't play lands or cast creatures, so he draws for turn and passes. I draw my cards for turn and cast Stoneforge Masterwork in my main phase. I put it onto the Mistform and then drop a Master of the Pearl Trident. I swing my Mistform at Steve this time for 9 commander damage, and I pass turn. At the end of my turn, Brion flashes in Gate to the Aether. Steve reveals a land from his Gate trigger, playing it. He then draws basically a new crypt full of cards, and I tell him not to worry about my board. Steve then upticks Nahiri, discarding a card and drawing a card. He plays a Plains as his land for turn, and he casts Citadel Siege. He names Khans and drops a Ghostly Prison next. Launch the Fleet is next, and Steve targets Audric and the irregulars with a spell. Moving to combat, his Siege triggers and targets Audric to put the 2+1/+1 counters on the creature. With the trigger still in the stack, I activate Nykthos to pay for Mystic Confluence, bouncing both of Steve's creatures and Brion's Swan. Steve then has to discard down to 7, and he passes. Danny reveals a mountain for his Gate trigger and draws for turn. He plays a Forest for turn, and he casts Selvala Stampede. I use Unsubstantiate to bounce it back to his hand, knowing that he's enough to recast it, but hopefully tying up the rest of his mana for the turn. Danny then does it again, and he votes for free while the rest of us vote for wild. Danny then reveals from his library, hitting a Siege Behemoth, Sakura Tribe Elder, and then a Tarka World Render. He then gets to put Thunderfoot Baloth from his hand onto the field. Moving to combat, Danny swings the Carnage Tyrant at me for 7. It doesn't make sense to block it with a Bow of Nylea and Siege Behemoth, so I just take the hit. At the end of Danny's turn, Brion flashes in Yidris while Danny discards down to 7. Brion reveals Minds Aglow, putting it to hand and drawing his chunk of cards. He plays a Command Tower and a Woodland Cemetery as his land for turn, and swings Yidris at Steve for 5, after paying the 2 for the Ghostly Prison. Brion then moves to his post-combat main phase, and we see a Winds of Change come from his hand. He cascades first, and reveals until he hits Hypergenesis. This resolves, and Brion gets to start us off, playing a Tainted Mountain. I play Merfolk Sovereign, while Steve plays a Bassandra. Danny plays Selvala, and Brion plays a Carplusian Forest. I play a Griffin Canyon, and Steve replaces Audric. Danny then replays Hellkite Tyrant, while Brion plays Call to the Grave. I play a Ghost Quarter, and Steve plays an Annex and Siamede. Danny plays a Terra Stomper, and Brion decides to stop. I decide to stop, Steve plays a Kythian's Irregulars, Danny decides to stop, and finally Steve decides to stop. We then resolve the Winds of Change, shuffling our hands in and drawing that many. Brion then casts Helm of Awakening, cascading once more. He goes until he hits Minds Aglow, which he just shuffled back in. Brion puts 1 into it, and I put in 1 as well, and the table draws 2. Brion then taps way too much mana to be casting a friendly spell, and sure enough, Ingorok's Wake hits the stack. He cascades, and he only has to go 1 card deep to hit Mana Barbs, putting it onto the field. The Wake then resolves, and blows up all of our creatures. Brion then taps his 2 remaining lands, taking 2 to cast a Standstill. He gets to cascade again, and reveals until he hits a Veteran Explorer. We make a slight misplay thinking the Standstill would be on the field, when the Explorer resolves and draw 2. Whoops. I reveal Shifting Sliver, and I put it onto the field thanks to the gate trigger. I then take 2 to cast Lord of Atlantis, and another 1 to cast a Phantasmal Image as a copy of the Lord of Atlantis. I then drop a Sage of Fables, losing another 2. I then take 2 more as I use some mana rocks to recast Mistform Ultimus. He comes in, gaining a +1/+1 counter from the Sage, and gets to equip the axe for free. I then take 3 to activate Nykthos, gaining 7 blue mana. I equip the Stoneforge Masterwork onto Mistform, and then pay 2 to have the Mirage Mirror become a copy of the Masterwork as well, and equip it onto Mistform once more. I have enough to take Brion out, which I do, because after that turn, I'm afraid of what his deck might do. Steve's a bit sad as he only draws 1 for turn, and plays a Mountain. He then brings out Aurelia, and moves to combat. He puts the Siege trigger on Aurelia, giving her 2 +1/+1 counters, and swings her at Danny for 5. Steve then moves to his second combat step, adding 2 more counters onto Aurelia, and hits me with the Angel for 7. Moving to his second main phase, Steve drops Blind Obedience and passes. Danny draws for turn and plays a Forest. He then drops a Cindervines and a Shaper's Sanctuary. Danny then sacrifices the Cindervines to blow up Blind Obedience, and he casts Malignus. Danny then drops Ronus, which gives him enough devotion to make Nylea a creature, and he passes to me. I play an island for my turn, and I activate Nykthos to make 7 blue. I cast Distant Melodies, naming Merfolk, and draw 4 cards. I then cast a Marrow Reechery, and follow up with a Meeboy Changeling. This counts as a Merfolk spell, so I get to untap the Nykthos with the Reechery trigger, and also the Amoeboid gains a +1/+1 counter, which Danny kindly provides. I then weigh my options and realize that Steve has a better chance of taking me out, as I have no way to interact with flyers. I once again have the Mirage Mirror become a copy of the Masterworks, and equip it onto Mistform. I swing Mistform at Steve, and realize that I'm only going to be doing 20 points of damage at this point. Thankfully I'm able to activate the Sliver Hive to make a Sliver token, which pumps Mistform by 2 power more, giving me enough to take him out. Danny draws for turn, and he recasts Xenagos in his main phase. He then drops a Spellbreaker Behemoth, and moves to combat. Xenagos bestows his gift of damage upon the Spellbreaker, and swings everything but his commander at me. Unfortunately, between the Trample and Death Touch, even with blocking, Danny still has me dead to rights, and he wins the game. Game review time. So, that last turn, I probably should have swung with everything that I could have at Danny. It was a lot of potential damage, and considering I wasn't really going to be able to effectively block anyway with all the Trample and Death Touch and Siege Behemoth damage, it really didn't make much sense to not. I think the issue was I tunnel visioned too much on the fact that I needed Mistform to deal 21 points of commander damage to take someone out, and as a result, I left a lot of damage on the table. I really liked Brion's deck, although I do have to say, when you're playing a deck that gives your opponents a lot of resources, and in his case a lot of cards, you have to be very, very careful. Oftentimes your finisher cards like Nekasar or any of the other ones that they typically run anyway, can come out too late. I think Danny and Steve certainly benefited from Brion being at the table since they both kept 5-card hands. Having never really played Boros decks, I like Steve's deck a lot, and he included a lot of fun cards like Reprisal and that split card that denied people from being able to play lands or creatures that turn. Danny also had some interesting new cards in his deck like Ravager Worm and Cindervines, doing a lot of really good work in a Gruul deck. It's a shame the Cindervines didn't get to do any damage to opponents, but the Ravager Worm certainly did, especially after it took out Bruce Tarl, and then he was able to sacrifice it to draw 10 cards. That was really, really impressive. I love the Riot mechanic, and I'm hoping to work some of it into my other decks. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 AM Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/MTGMudsta. And lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/MTGMudsta. This video is brought to you in support by my patrons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit the link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.